The 1970s witnessed a renaissance in film style in which cinematography was utilized to reveal aspects of society that had previously gone unexplored. National cinemas took advantage of this movement in order to expose specific characteristics of their own nations via aesthetic style. In the US, films such as Chinatown used dark, neo-noir lighting to expose the underbelly of the corruption within American capitalism, while Apocalypse Now demonstrated the crisis in American patriotism and imperialism. These films were drawing on advances in cinematic style in Europe, particularly in the exemplum of the French, Italian, West German collaboration film Bernardo Bertolucci's The Conformist, shot by Vittorio Storaro. The innovative film takes advantage of lighting to create the atmosphere of Plato's cave, which Michael Walker describes as the dominant political metaphor for the film. The essence of the myth of the cave is that the prisoners mistake the shadows of reality for reality itself. It is through this perspective that the titular conformist, Marcelo, attempts to form what he perceives as a normal life. He thus becomes a projection, losing all individuality and becoming a brutal agent of fascism. This contrasts the long-standing idea that the fascism that dominated Europe in the 1930s was a result of the innate brutality of the European masses, but rather suggests that it was born of conformity to the state in a select group. The Australian film industry was a part of this movement, exploring myths of the Australian landscape and colonial identity. Wake in Fright, an international collaboration led by Canadian director Ted Kotcheff with American and Australian production companies, uses cinematography to reveal the undercurrent of violence in the national image of the pristine outback, which seems so subversive now because Kotcheff's vision of hell is a funhouse of the Australian stereotype. The film tells of John Grant, a teacher who comes from the Sydney to the outback for work. As he returns to Sydney to visit his girlfriend, he must stop in the town of the Yabba, a seemingly innocuous town in which the true nature of the outback is revealed. The opening shot of the film takes advantage of the widescreen format to create a vast, empty landscape for John to enter with the audience. A highly exposed, almost monotone landscape provides the impression of a blank canvas, which is merely a mask for the reality. John's descent into madness is reflected in the shifting of the cinematography towards a darker, more claustrophobic filmic style. For example, when John goes on a kangaroo hunt with Doc, the human embodiment of outback brutality, there is no establishing shot to orient the audience to the outside. Rather, the shots remain tight, point-of-view shots in the dark of the night that prevent John from ever knowing where he is going. He remains trapped, lost in the outback, in spite of the fact that he's constantly moving. Therein lies the root of his madness. While the myth of the outback is that it should assert one's masculinity, John finds himself stripped of all humanity and even sanity, a victim of the outback's true nature. Peter Weir's Picnic at Hanging Rock is perhaps one of the most powerful and exemplar Australian films of this period that attempts to debunk the myth of the superiority of a colonial culture through the lighting by cinematographer Russell Boyd. The film, based on the novel by Joan Lindsay, recounts the story of the unexplained disappearance of 3 schoolgirls and their maths teacher at Hanging Rock in Victoria, and the subsequent impact on their school and community. The film is visually and thematically split between a dream within a dream atmosphere prior to their disappearance, and the stark, realistic style used to depict the boarding house. Boyd placed dyed muslin nets over the camera lens when shooting the picnic scenes in an attempt to mimic the style of the Romantic period in Australian art, the Impressionist period of about 1900, which concentrated on open Australian landscapes, often depicting the daily lives in a bush environment. This technique creates the yellow, diffused, dreamlike atmosphere that dominates the beginning of the film, as the girls attempt to domesticate the land with colonial practices. However, as the lighting indicates, this can only be a dream. The act of domestication is incompatible with the land, as is ultimately revealed by the girls' disappearance. This is when the film changes its palette to a cooler, crisper lighting style. Thus, the mysterious horror of the rocks is translated into real horror for the girls and headmistress of the boarding school, which is totally out of place in Australia, an incongruent remnant of the empire. Their structured colonial institution and architectural anachronism in the Australian bush falls apart at the foundations. Girls are withdrawn from the school, the girls lose their memories, and Sarah and Miss Appleyard ultimately commit suicide. The film therefore suggests that colonial culture as a whole is incapable of surviving the Australian landscape. Both Picnic at Hanging Rock and Wake in Fright were part of the numerous Australian films that were critically acclaimed both domestically and internationally, indicating their relevance as part of this new cinematic style. They took on the national myths and, like in Europe and in the US, used the power of cinema to debunk them. Australian cinema is often viewed as an independent entity, a competitor to Hollywood. However, perhaps its contextualization within this movement indicates that it needs to be viewed as an important part of greater international movements.